Blake Lively is officially in hot water, and wow, I did not see this plot twist coming. So here's the deal. Blake and her lawyers strolled into a Manhattan courtroom yesterday, and the New York Times is literally calling this her final shot. Her last chance to actually make something land with that California law she's pinned her entire comeback on. And right when you start thinking, okay, maybe she pulls it off. Maybe she scrapes some kind of win out of this disaster. The actual woman who wrote the law steps forward and basically says she wants zero connection to what Blake is doing with it. That's a terrible day. A truly painfully terrible day. Let me rewind and paint the full picture because there are several moving parts here and every single one matters. Blake's legal squad has been leaning hard on California Civil Code 178.7. This anti-harassment statute that was built specifically to protect everyday people from being hunted and intimidated by richer, more powerful bullies. The mastermind behind that bill, the person who fought tooth and nail to get it passed, is a woman named Victoria Burke, a professor and lawyer who genuinely believed this law could be a weapon for survivors. And Victoria has now gone public with her frustration. She posted, and I'm paraphrasing here because you need to feel the weight of this, she said she never imagined her bill would land in the middle of a firestorm like this. She called herself the bill's architect, insisted she strongly believes in its constitutionality, and then dropped this. She is, quote, unhappy with it being weaponized as a PR redemption tool by Blake Lively and her team. She also said she does not think the judge should award attorney fees in this case. That is the woman who wrote the law saying that about the person trying to wield it. Come on, when the person who built the hammer tells you to put it down, that actually means something. That is not a tiny detail. And here's the part that really gets under my skin. This law was introduced in 16 states. It's been cited in high-profile cases. It was designed for one reason only: to level the playing field for people who don't have armies of publicists and entertainment lawyers backing them up. Oh, and would you look at that? Blake Lively, one of the most plugged-in, resource-heavy women in all of Hollywood, is now the public face of this law in court. Victoria Burke is watching the legislative work of her entire life get hijacked as a PR strategy, and she's actually speaking out about it. You know what? That takes serious nerve because she didn't have to open her mouth. She could have stayed completely silent, but she didn't. All right, let's get into what Blake's legal team is really demanding in that courtroom. Because this goes so much further than just wanting their legal fees paid. They strolled in asking for a mini-trial. Yes, a full-blown mini-trial with expert witnesses and testimony, just to figure out how much cash Blake should pocket after a case that was already settled. Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively settled this thing. No jury ever debated it. No judge ever made a ruling on the facts. They settled, and now Blake's crew is standing before Judge Lyman saying, "Yeah, but we still deserve major damages. We want attorney's fees. We want compensatory damages, and we want those damages tripled." That's literally what they're asking for. And Judge Lyman, he was not exactly laying out the welcome mat for this argument. From what leaked out of that courtroom, he was shoving back hard. He straight up questioned whether Blake's team had even proven malice, which is a pretty critical legal bar. He asked whether their client actually suffered the damages the way they claimed. At one point, he basically hinted to Blake's lawyers that their client could just say she wasn't seeking damages beyond fees, and this whole mess would probably end right there. But Blake's team refused that off-ramp. They kept demanding everything, and that tells you exactly what this is really about. This isn't about justice anymore. It's about walking away from this disaster and being able to say they won something. Because if Blake gets even $1, one symbolic dollar, her team can spin that to the media as a victory. They can announce, "We took Justin Baldoni to court. We settled, and then we still got damages." And that becomes the headline. That becomes the narrative. That's the game plan here. And honestly, most people watching this case up close can see exactly what's unfolding. What makes it even uglier is the bigger legal nightmare starting to creep up around all of this. First Amendment lawyers are now jumping in, and some of them are genuinely terrified. So, let me get this straight. If someone slaps you with a public accusation of something as heavy as sexual assault or harassment, and you genuinely believe it's a total lie designed to wreck your name, so you decide to fight back in court to clear your reputation, well, surprise. You could now be stuck paying that accuser's legal bills if your case doesn't go your way, even if most of your claims get tossed out. Not because a jury ruled against you. Not because a judge said you were wrong on the facts. No, just because your case didn't wrap up in the exact way the law demands to avoid that fee-shifting nightmare. One legal expert quoted by the New York Times put it in plain English. He said, "If you've been falsely accused of something as brutal as sexual assault, and you honestly believe you've got a rock-solid lawsuit, this mess is going to make you seriously reconsider dragging it to court because the financial danger is now absolutely massive." And that chilling effect on legit defamation cases? That's exactly what critics of how Blake Lively's team is twisting this law are freaking out about. This isn't some imaginary problem. It has real-world fallout for real human beings who have absolutely nothing to do with Blake Lively or Justin Baldoni. And Victoria Burke, the woman who fought tooth and nail to pass this law so vulnerable people could stand up to the powerful, is now watching it potentially get reshaped by a case that flips that whole idea completely on its head. And honestly, that's the part that eats at me the most. Because if you take a step back and look at the full picture, this law was never, ever meant for someone in Blake's shoes. At all. It was built for the person who gets targeted by someone with deeper pockets, wider connections, heavier influence. It was built for the person who doesn't have a publicist on speed dial, who doesn't have back-channel relationships with editors at the New York Times, who doesn't have a husband with the kind of reach and resources that Ryan Reynolds commands. It was built for the exact opposite of Blake Lively's situation, and now she's using it, in a way that even its own creator is visibly uncomfortable with, to try to squeeze a financial victory out of a case that already finished. And speaking of the New York Times, let's not glide past that piece of this story, because it actually matters. There's been endless chatter about the timing and the framing of that original reporting on Justin Baldoni. The article dropped in a way that gave Justin almost no chance to respond before it had already exploded everywhere. The framing leaned hard in Blake's direction right from the start. And now, even the New York Times is describing this court appearance as Blake's last chance under an untested state law. That's their own wording. The very same outlet that many people believed was firmly in her corner from day one is now framing this as a long-shot gamble. That shift in tone is worth paying attention to, because what Judge Lyman said in that courtroom was pretty darn revealing. He flat-out questioned whether malice had actually been established. He asked whether the damages they were claiming had any real proof behind them. He practically handed Blake's lawyers a golden exit by pointing out that if their client just said she wasn't chasing damages beyond legal fees, this whole circus could end nice and clean. And they said no. They want the full trial. They want the expert witnesses. They want the treble damages. They want absolutely everything. Even knowing that no jury ever sat through this case. Even knowing that most of Justin Baldoni's claims got dismissed. Not necessarily on the actual facts, sure, but they still got tossed. And Judge Lyman himself made comments suggesting those weren't exactly proven cases of workplace harassment either. So here's what you've got. A judge who looks pretty skeptical. The woman who wrote the law saying she's flat out uncomfortable with how it's being used. First Amendment lawyers sounding alarm bells about what this precedent could unleash. And Blake's team? Still standing in that courtroom, asking for the biggest possible payout. That takes a serious amount of nerve. I'll hand them that. Now, the 178. 7 question itself is pretty interesting because this law has never really been stress tested at this level before. It was introduced across 16 states. It grabbed attention. It was hailed as this major piece of legislation for harassment victims, but it has never gone through a high-profile, federal case like this, where every single angle is being ripped apart by powerhouse attorneys on both sides. And the way Blake's team is using it, specifically bundling attorney fees together with compensatory and punitive damages all in one go, is being called an extremely aggressive reading of what the law actually allows. They are not playing it safe here. They are pushing the absolute outer edge of whatever this statute might possibly cover. And if Judge Lyman rules against them on that interpretation, it could actually shrink how this law gets applied in future cases involving people who genuinely need it. Victoria Burke has to be sitting there watching this disaster unfold and feeling some type of way about it. She put serious blood, sweat, and tears into getting this passed. She believed in what it was supposed to do. And now the loudest, most public test case for her baby is Blake Lively, trying to cash in with damages after settling a lawsuit against a Hollywood director. That is not the story she wrote this law for. And the fact that she spoke up publicly on her own without anyone pushing her, that's actually pretty remarkable. Most people in her position would stay quiet. They wouldn't want to get dragged into the drama. They'd let it play out. But she said something, and I think she spoke because she saw what was happening and just couldn't keep her mouth shut. What I keep circling back to is this. Blake had an escape route from all of this that didn't involve any of what's going down right now. They settled. The case was finished. She could have quietly moved on. Started repairing her image through work, through time, through just fading into the background for a while and letting people forget. That's what most people in her position do. But instead, her team marched back into court asking for more. Asking for a mini-trial, asking for treble damages, asking for punitive awards after a settlement, after the case was already closed. And by doing that, they've managed to yank the spotlight back onto everything people were already side-eyeing. The way this whole mess started. The way Justin Baldoni got painted in the press before he even had a chance to respond. That suspicious timeline so many people called out. All of it is back on the table now because Blake's team decided they needed a win so badly they kept fighting for it. And don't forget the Wayfarer lawsuit, the one filed against the publicist and others tied to the media strategy around Justin's image. That's still sitting there too. That case raised a ton of questions about coordination between Blake's team and journalists. Questions that haven't disappeared just because the main lawsuit settled. And now with this fee hearing dragging everything back into the public eye, those questions are getting louder again, not quieter. It also shoves Reynolds back into the frame. Because if you believe, as many do, that this was a coordinated strategy from the beginning, Ryan's role in that plan doesn't vanish just because Blake is the one standing in court. He's been awfully quiet through all of this, which is pretty notable given how publicly he backed Blake early on. That silence reads very differently now than it would have 6 months ago. And look, I want to be fair here, because I think it's important to actually consider what Blake's supporters would say at this point. They would say she experienced something real on that set. They would argue she had every right to chase legal action. They would insist the settlement itself proves Justin Baldoni's team wanted out. And honestly, those aren't totally insane points to make. A settlement doesn't automatically mean anyone is innocent or guilty. Cases wrap up for all sorts of reasons: financial heat, PR nightmares, or just being flat out exhausted. So no, I'm not up here claiming the settlement proves Blake Lively was lying about everything. But here's where even the kindest, most generous reading of Blake's situation slams into a brick wall. The judge in this case, Judge Lyman, actually went through the claims. He looked at what they were calling workplace harassment, and he didn't just toss those claims on some procedural technicality. He made real, substantive comments about them. He said the bulk of what was presented didn't even meet the basic threshold for workplace harassment. That is not a loophole. That is a judge staring at the evidence Blake's own team put forward and saying, "This doesn't hold water." And that matters. It matters a whole lot when you're simultaneously trying to convince the public that you're a victim who deserves a giant pile of cash. So now Blake's legal squad is stuck in this bizarre position. They're asking for serious financial awards in a case where the judge already questioned whether the core claims were even real, where the law they're leaning on was built for a completely different kind of victim, where the person who wrote that law has publicly said she's uncomfortable with how it's being used, and where no jury ever heard the full story or made any final decision. And they're doing all of this out in the open with cameras, reporters, and the New York Times watching every move. Which means every single day this drags on, more people are reading and forming opinions. And based on everything leaking out of that courtroom, those opinions are not swinging Blake's way. Judge Lyman's skepticism was so obvious that legal commentators caught it immediately. When a judge starts literally coaching the losing side toward a graceful exit, and that side says, "No thanks," that tells you everything. It tells you this team is either insanely confident in a legal argument that most outside experts find shaky, or they are so desperate for a public victory that they're willing to blow it all on a very public, very embarrassing loss. And after watching this camp's antics for months, yeah, we all know exactly which one it is. Because let's be real, what actually happens if Blake Lively loses this hearing? It's not just another legal L. It becomes the final nail in a story that went absolutely nowhere the way her team planned. The original game plan, and anyone paying attention saw this coming, was to get in front of any bad press from the "It Ends With Us" promo disaster, paint Blake as the poor victim, weaponize the courts and a cozy media cycle to make Justin Baldoni the monster, then stroll off with her reputation polished and maybe a settlement she could quietly call a win. That was the move, and it backfired. Justin's crew fought way harder than they expected. The Wayfarer lawsuit dropped some very awkward questions about their media tactics. Big chunks of Blake's case got tossed. The settlement landed with zero public victory for her. And now here she is, crawling back to court trying to scrape something from the ruins. Even the judge looks confused why she's still pushing. Victoria Burke's words will haunt this case forever, because every single time someone writes about this hearing, about what Blake is demanding, about how this law is getting twisted, Victoria's quote will be right there. The law's own creator, unhappy it's being used as a PR redemption weapon. That soundbite never dies, and it will wreck every attempt Blake's team makes to sell this as some noble legal crusade for harassment survivors. Because the woman who built that legal framework is saying the exact opposite. What I really hope comes out of all this circus, beyond the drama, the gossip, the courtroom theatrics, is that Victoria Burke keeps running her mouth. Because she has a perspective no one else does. She knows what this law was built to do. She knows who it was built for. And if she's brave enough to say publicly that she thinks it's being abused here, that voice matters. Not just for this train wreck, but for how this law gets used from now on. Because if the highest profile test case for Section 178(7) ends up as nothing but a cautionary tale about a mega famous celebrity using it to chase a PR victory after a settlement, that does serious damage to every future case where an actually vulnerable person tries to use it for its real purpose. That's the real cost here. Not Blake Lively's image. Not Justin Baldoni's image. Not the Hollywood soap opera of it all. The actual price tag is on the people Victoria Burke wrote that law for in the first place. The ones who needed something on the books to shield them from bullies with more power. And if this case weakens that protection, if it makes judges more suspicious, if it makes juries more cynical, if it hands defense lawyers fresh ammo to argue the law is getting abused, then everyone who comes after this pays the price for what Blake's team decided to pull in that courtroom. So yeah, we're going to keep watching how Judge Lyman rules. We're going to keep watching whether Victoria Burke says anything else. And we will absolutely be right here when the next update drops. because this disaster is nowhere near finished. Hit that subscribe button, because when the ruling comes down, we are breaking down every single piece of it. Breaking down every single piece of it.